Okay, on the show today, honored to have Richard Boyatzis. So Richard is a professor. He's been working with various universities you will have heard of, published author, many good books, including these two that I have on my recommended reading list for my leadership courses. He's got a book out a couple of years ago on change. We're going to talk to him about change, resonant leadership, emotional intelligence, all kinds of topics. Richard, your CV is as long as my arm. I think any of the coaches listening and HR people definitely know who you are. But maybe the yoga people less so, but I think they'll be interested too. So Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
So I normally start off asking people a little bit about their life story, but in terms of the work you do now, how did you get into that? But with a particular lens on your relationship with body, mind, anything like that, that might flow into the story. So it's quite an interesting story from what I've heard.
Well, oddly enough, my first degree is in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT. My specialty was control systems in interplanetary vehicles. And as a child of Greek immigrants, and my father got to the U.S. just in time to get drafted into the U.S. Army and work the jungles of Panama, and then land on Omaha Beach and go through France and Germany. So he gets out, and he was in university in Greece, but he couldn't return. He'd met my mother, they got married, so he became a waiter. Like every Greek on this side in the U.S. side of the Atlantic that I ever knew worked in the restaurant business. So despite all sorts of struggles where they thought I was cognitively slow in the public school system in New York City, it turned out I got tested when we moved just out of the city. And they said, you're really good in math and science, which was perfect because I always loved space. And I thought space was the kind of place I wanted to do my work. I am, not just was, but I am very analytic. I am a nerd. And that's where the oddity comes in, because even in high school, I had a band that played, like 2 paying jobs a weekend, and always had a lot of girlfriends, very social. But nobody noticed that because back in the 50s, everybody was more focused on anybody who knew math and physics really well. So I go to MIT, I'm doing all this stuff, I run out of money. MIT gets me a job doing the very research and work that I'm supposed to at an experimental gas dynamics research lab for Northrop Norrell, a big aerospace company at the time. So I go out there and work for almost 6 months in 1966 and discover that on the whole, the work is boring. In those days, I guess the Air Force had approached me and I couldn't be an astronaut because of my eyes. You had to have perfect vision in those days. But the actual work when you're doing the science and the building these things is mostly you and computers. And, except for side trips to talk to the test pilots, which were quite exciting, it was devastating to my dream. And I didn't know what else to do. So, I went back to MIT and I finished my degree. And that's when I said, well, I've got to go into management. I don't want to go in the restaurant business because I tried that a number of summers. I didn't think I was really good enough to make it as a major pro in music. So I said, okay, I'll go into management. I take a management course from Dave Kolb at MIT, who at the time was finishing his PhD at Harvard. And he introduces his course to all these undergraduates as a course in organizational psychology, which to me sounded like utter crap. Except he said 2 words in describing his course that made me run to the basement at the Sloan School and get it and try to get in, which I did. He said, no tests. That was the defining moment in the future of my life. My test phobia won out. He introduced me to the field of psychology, in particular applied psychology. And the next thing I know, he's got me in PhD seminars and people who are major figures in the field, Ed Schein, Dave McClelland, and others. Next thing I know, I'm in a PhD program in psychology at Harvard. And it all started in the spring of 1967 with a study on how people help each other or not. So I've been at this process for a long time. And I developed a new therapy program for alcoholics and drug addicts based on learning power skills, self-management and interpersonal in 1970, and started training them. So in fact, when I graduated with my doctorate, I turned down a post at Yale because I didn't really want to teach. I wanted to do psychotherapy and research. And when you're working with alcoholics and drug addicts, the research has to involve an awful lot of stuff about the hormonal system in particular. And part of my therapy program was teaching fundamentals of meditation.
And this was
And
back in the day. Richard, can I jump in?
sure.
I know you love your topic, so I might do that from time to time.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Is that
Because
right?
I'm a professor. I'm known for
You're like
being
me,
able
you
to
can
speak
talk
for
all
8
day as well.
hours on a drop of a hat.
What I want to sort of point out really is this was really early days before a mindfulness revolution, in the Western world.
Right.
And sort of in a way, Western civilization had kind of really made a mistake, which is saying, what matters is cognitive only, knowing about things. And then as soon as you go into management, you realize, well, hang on a minute.
Wait,
What makes a good manager isn't someone who's cognitively smart with a high IQ.
right.
They need to have these other skills, right? And you actually kind of map them with people like Daniel Goleman, right?
Yeah. I mean, I actually, as we know, Descartes got it wrong. And if I go back, as I often do, to ancient Greeks who very often got it right, Hippocrates on his home island of Kos set up the first medical school, the Asclepion. And if you go and visit it, you'll realize that they practiced holistic medicine. There was the non-ambulatory care facility, and then as soon as somebody could walk, they went around and prayed to all these votives to the gods. And as soon as they could walk more than that, they had to do long walks and a pilgrimage in this pine forest in nature before they could be deemed healthy enough to return to life.
And theatre too, right? They were doing nature, exercise,
yeah, that's right.
Theatre. It was a really holistic kind of view of medicine that somehow got lost.
Yeah, and if you look at any of the organized religions of the world, they all practice a form of meditation called prayer. We all have chants, we all have smells. In my case, the Greek Orthodox Church has very particular strong incense, but the chants all put you in this state, which is a psychophysiological state. And to try to help people deal with their behavior or their feelings without having them learn about their body is crazy, because it can't happen.
Yeah. So it's sort of, I always think of emotional intelligence as bringing the body back into leadership, management, some of the places you work. You can't talk about self-awareness without it.
The whole thing started back in the 50s when McClelland and others, were answering the clarion call for how do we predict better leaders and professionals. And he said, it's not that simple. And a few of his colleagues did the same thing, Baldwin and Bronfenbrenner and others. So that in 1970, I did the first competency model of supervisory chaplains in the Navy, U.S. Navy. And the whole idea was to look for the characteristics of people that are effective. So you have to develop measures of effective and ineffective in the roles. And as we continued to do that, we started to develop this notion that, yes, there are certain behaviors that people who are effective in helping roles as well as management leadership roles do, and that those are better understood as, we call them competencies. In most countries of the world, I'd use capabilities because it's more accurate, as a set of behaviors organized around an underlying intent. And if you don't understand the underlying intent, you don't get when the behaviors should be used. You can't sense the differences. So now, and then so you jump forward 25 years later, Dan Goleman and I were in the PhD program together at Harvard, and we hung around together. We were in the same social group, and my thesis advisor was one of his mentors and all this kind of stuff. So over the years, we had kept feeding each other stuff, even when he was at the New York Times. And when the 95 book came out, Emotional Intelligence, it was really giving a label to the things we'd been talking about and studying for 25 years, but a label that was easier for people who weren't specialists to understand. And how could you possibly grasp emotional self-awareness if you're not in tune with your body?
Yeah, yeah, and emotional intelligence took something that was intuitive. People kind of go, oh, he's a people person. Oh, he's got something that makes
Right.
people like him. He's a great leader. And it took it into specifics that people could geek out on,
Right.
even try and measure. And then for me, the emotional intelligence opened up mindfulness, which opens up embodiment. So this is kind of, you know, tracking back. So we sort of owe a debt of gratitude, as it were, anyone who's in the yoga space or anything, to this lineage, in that it opened it up, it made it accessible. And something else I've also heard you say, and I know is true from elsewhere, is that a lot of the interventions it also found weren't very good. Like most therapy isn't working very well. Most leadership
That's
training
right.
is probably a waste of money, because as soon as you
Yep.
start measuring things, then you can say, well, is something successful or not?
Well, and that's very often because, I mean, I just reviewed a paper for an academic journal an hour ago where they wanted to come up with a competency model of a particular kind of leader. And while the review of the literature was great, they just interviewed 33 people who were leaders in that arena. Well, the problem is 70 to 80% of them probably weren't very good. So you're building your
Yeah.
models based on, first, the wrong people, and secondly, it probably has a lot of values in it. And that was where, you know, some of the holistic medicine notions and some of the even new age in the 60s and early 70s actually helped us, because as people started to turn to the Far East to look for practices like meditation and started to do more yoga, um, we began doing it, but then also studying it. And very often the resistance was because people thought you were trying to do some kind of religious indoctrination, when in fact, what a lot of us in this arena were doing were just saying, let's go inside. Now, here we are decades later, and for some of these things, we now have some really good neurological evidence. We know that brains communicate to other brains emotions, except for people on the autism spectrum disorder, which
Yeah,
they have a
you
dysfunction in the
read.
default mode. But if people communicate emotions brain to brain in thousandths of a second, that means that it doesn't matter what your face is showing, what you're
Yeah,
really feeling inside is coming out. So if you're not able to center, if you can't calm the noise going on in your brain or silence the demons, that's what you infect people with. You're not infecting them with your intent, you're infecting them with what you're really feeling.
right. I had this thought just before this interview, actually, because I had a difficult, we're moving house, always fun. Had a difficult conversation with my wife about 15 minutes before the interview. I said, look, we just thought, I'm interviewing Richard. I don't want to be resonating I don't want to be, you know, giving off kind of bad vibes, man, you know? And it's like, you know, self-awareness, regulating
So how'd you
myself a
turn it
little bit.
around?
I
Oh,
tried to, I
fine.
had 10 minutes to turn it around, at least half turn it around. But you wrote a whole
What
book
did
on
you
it.
do? No, it's just work with me here. What did you
God,
do?
I took a breath, put my feet on the floor, did the embodiment training stuff that I
So
teach.
you did some deep breathing.
Yeah, but diaphragmatic breathing with a longer out breath, that
Right.
combination.
Okay.
I noticed some tension in my trapezius, my shoulders, so I kind of let
Yep.
that go. Took a breath, reminded myself of what I cared about. So I'd call that centering around values rather than just a physical centering. So they're the primary things I did in the
Right.
10 minutes between.
So you did what experienced meditators or yoga or Tai Chi practitioners can do, which is flip your hormonal balance in 30 to 45 seconds. Now, the other thing you could have done, and you did exactly the quickest and easiest things to do for somebody who's practiced. The other things you could have done was just to stop and remember your first date with your wife and the first time the two of you just laughed uncontrollably, and think of some of those moments, and it would have also done a similar thing,
That's similar thing.
because love and compassion really are very powerful source emotions.
No, you talk about a lot of the things that I'm advising my trainers in Ukraine who are doing trauma training at the moment that I've taught,
Right.
with play, nature. You reminds me a lot your work of Stephen Porges's work on polyvagal theory, which is the basis
Yes,
of the
that's
trauma
right.
work that we do. You know, ventral
Yep.
vagal, co-regulation, positive social connections, you know, things that have been in sort of Mediterranean culture, I would say, for a long time, naturally, you know, for nature, eating good food with nice friends. But that bringing that into a language that is accessible to people in the business world or people that need a kind of a
Right.
theory on it. And this idea of emotional contagion is very important, right? That it's not what we're saying, it's how we're saying it. And
Well,
it's
and
all
it's
coming
even
across.
sorry,
After you.
it's even deeper than that. It's what you're feeling inside. So it's not just, I mean,
Yeah.
yes, you're right. It's how you're saying it, but there are people who can mask their faces, but what they don't appreciate is that they're still radiating out the angst or whatever it is that they're feeling. And
What's the
that,
mechanism for that, Richard? Is it sort of micro signals, like I can be pretending to smile, but actually you'll notice my eyes are narrow? Or is it a sort of electromagnetic thing? Like, what do
a
you say
lot,
is the mechanism for it?
a number of neurologists wrote a marvelous book called The Anatomy of Love. I think it came out in 2000, in which they documented in a lot of animals, including primates, brain to brain direct communications. They documented evidence of that in with human mothers and infants. What they didn't do is make the leap to adults.
Right.
Now, meanwhile, a few years earlier, Joseph Ledoux had done some of his key work, foundational work in brain-to-brain communications, and started with mice. But we now know that it emanates in part from the limbic system, but it's not that simple because everything in the brain is networks. You know, it's not eh, people who hang on to right brain, left brain are in the 90s. That isn't,
Yeah.
neuroscientists don't even talk about that
No,
anymore.
that'd be, yeah.
And some of the other parts of the brain. The key is the network. And in this case, the network that is the most responsible was defined by Rakel in the early 90s as the default mode network. My colleague, Tony Jack at Case Western Reserve, who is a full-time neuroscientist, I mean, he has a theory of opposing poles of reason, and he says a better name for that network in the brain is the empathic network, because that's the network you activate when you are tuned into or open to new ideas or other people or emotions. Now, sadly, another dominant network called the task positive network, which he calls the analytic network, you engage and invoke, instantiate, they call it technically, whenever you're doing anything analytic or financial or abstract or trying to make a decision or solve a problem. So as Tony points out, these two networks not only don't have much of an overlap, but they suppress each other.
Right.
So one of the dilemmas we have is that when we're trying to help someone, we as the helpers, whether we're coaches or trainers or parents, we need the analytic network to understand the other person, but we need the empathic network to know what they're feeling and even to notice it. So we have to practice going back and forth. And although we don't have the direct data to prove this, Tony and I have been trying to get money to show that we think if we looked at leader followers, or, you know, we don't work in this area, but even parent children, but thinking about adults, physicians, nurses, etc., to patients, that we'd be able to show that these activations are happening in thousandths of a second.
They're very quick. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
deeply unconscious, which is why the mind body. I mean, the most significant thing, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, the most significant thing you could do to learn, to understand what you're feeling, is learn the biomarkers, the somatic markers of when you're off.
Richard, in terms of the resonance side, so like a lot of questions I get are like, hey, I'm a manager in a company where everyone's depressed. How do I not let it rub off on me? Or, you know, the Ukrainian trainers right now,
Right.
hey, I'm around a lot
Well,
of traumatized people. How do I not let that impact me?
other than drinking a lot.
Well, the coping mechanisms, sort of looking at healthy and unhealthy, is definitely one way to go, isn't it? But like,
Oh, well, come on,
interestingly,
you have
they
a
pick up
British
on it great.
accent. You have a
I've got
British
an Irish
accent.
family, but I'm long-term sober actually. So I was interested in your
Oh,
work
okay. Well, then
on
you
sobriety.
appreciate the distinction.
So,
So you don't hang out in pubs. But no, but seriously, what the biggest dilemma, because I get that question asked all the time on the 1.5 million people have taken one of my MOOCs and this and all this kind of
yeah,
thing.
the big online courses, the MOOCs,
Yeah,
millions of people have done them, right?
right. That if you have a dissonant boss, first you have to acknowledge that the person probably comes across as dissonant because they're defensive and scared. Now, they may act amazingly aggressive and narcissistic, but those are signs of defensiveness. And very often, by taking what I call the positive emotional attractor of talking about moments of service, moments of hope, moments of gratitude, moments of true mindfulness, you can actually bring them into this positive emotional attractor space. And if you can do it in little bits, small
Mm,
doses, because you're
mm.
not going to take somebody who's defensive or angry and make a big leap, but if you can bring them in small doses and then just keep doing that, over a number of days, number of weeks, whatever, they may start to get to feel more comfortable and open to have a conversation with you about it. There are times in which that doesn't work. Then your job is to create an emotional umbrella over the people who report to you or the people you're trying to help. Because if you
Okay.
don't, you're going to just pass through all of the crap that's falling on your head. And that's inappropriate sharing.
Right. To just vent on them.
Now,
So I guess with
that
a lot
has
of,
a time limit. Let me get
yeah,
to the
go on.
specific answer to your question. That has a time limit. At the point that you're doing that for more than 6 months, it's eating away at your spirit.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would say people can't last too long, more than a year or two in that environment before they lose heart. So the alternative is to leave.
Yeah, and for the trainers that are working around a lot of very traumatized people who aren't, nasty people or anything, but they're
Right.
certainly, they're
That's
not in
different.
that empathic default mode very often. There's a numbing, there's a
Right.
constant fight or flight that's going on in their system. One thing I say is spend time around people who aren't like that, or spend time
Right.
alone or in nature.
We
And there's
know
a
that there are
limit though, right?
right. We know that a walk in nature, just an article today summarizing in a neuroscience newsletter summarizing why green space in urban environments is so important. I mean, they're little. I live in a national park. I mean, the ocean's on one side of me, and acres of woods on the other. But even if you're in an urban environment, to get into walking in a park ends up being very powerful because a walk in nature, we now have enough studies to show it activates it. We also know that laughing does. So, one of the things that happens, especially in traumatizing situations, is to use humor. And some people say, well, it's a steam valve or it's a relief valve. It's actually more than that.
Mm,
And even to use what sometimes people refer to as black humor, which
yeah,
is,
yeah.
the dark side, but people are laughing about it, it can actually help. The key is when you're dealing with people who either are traumatized or have been, you have to do this in small doses. Don't expect any big movement in a sudden thing because it's not realistic.
And I like the emphasis you've put on stress work. Maybe you could sort of lay out the insights you've had around stress.
Right.
You know, it's not just about reducing the stress.
Sure.
I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah. We all are exposed to too much stress. And the kind of stress I'm talking about isn't the trauma or acute stress. I'm talking about the annoying stress. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, your cell phone drops a call. Those annoying stress episodes, for most of us, even pre-COVID, were over the top, and they resulted in strain, the medical thing. Now, when you're under that degree of chronic annoying stress, you are cognitively, perceptually, and emotionally impaired. I mean, your peripheral vision drops from 180 to 30 degrees.
Yep.
You can't think clearly, and you certainly aren't open to feelings. If you add to that acute stressors like a pandemic, like the financial uncertainty about it, like the social disruption, or more acute stressors like people dropping bombs on you, you've got a real kind of mess. And to say to people, let's lower your stress level, is the wrong thing. Because what you're doing is saying, we're going to make it feel better because it's not going to hurt as much, but it's still hurting. The effects of mild stress are still just as bad. The one thing we can do as humans is to go into what I call, for sake of conversation, renewal moments. Technically, they're activating the parasympathetic nervous system. We know what those are. You specialize in them. I mean, I'll just go over a number that have been shown
Please.
in many studies to really activate the parasympathetic nervous system across people in different cultures, different genders, different races. This is human physiology. Meditation helps. Yoga helps. Tai Chi helps. Prayer helps if it's to a loving God.
Okay.
If you're praying to a vengeful God, it stimulates the sympathetic and you're off back into the stress. Exercise helps if it's modest. Going for a walk in nature helps because it tends to take you outside of focusing on yourself to noticing other things. And it is quite literally more centering in that sense. Feeling hopeful about the future helps.
Yeah, hope. That's one of yours.
Being in a loving relationship helps.
Yeah.
Helping people less fortunate helps. Helping the elderly helps. I tell my students, helping elderly professors will get you closer to heaven. And we know since the 70s, actually, in research, that having dogs, cats, or in some parts of the world, horses or monkeys really help because the stroking stimulates the parasympathetic system in them, and then you pick it up because of the emotional contagion, and then you're going back and forth. On top of that, we know that laughter, in particular joy and playfulness, helps. And a walk in nature, as I said, and the one that I just read a meta-analysis of neurological studies a month ago that I now have added to my list because it crossed enough countries and genders, is playing music or dancing to music.
Yeah, that
Listening to music by itself doesn't do it consistently enough.
Okay, yeah. We sometimes reduce these to self-regulation, co-regulation, eco-regulation, and theo-regulation, which I have a Greek member of the team added that term.
Right.
But it doesn't surprise me. Movement, play.
That's how they function. But in reality, we're talking about certain basic core emotions: hope, gratitude, and compassion, laughter, playfulness, not happiness. Happiness is mixed. Laughter, playfulness, and then, what we variously call centering.
How do they interact, or the combination? So I think many people listening will go, yeah, great list, thanks for the reminder, doctor. And it's, how do they interact? So I'll give you an example. Today I had an hour, had a kind of stressful week, and I really felt like, I just felt my body went, I'm going to go for a walk in the park and not do the yoga that I planned. And that just sort of intuitively felt like the right choice. And I literally had a choice because in my diary it said yoga hour, but I went, no, I'm going outside. And sometimes like I need to be alone and meditate. Sometimes like I need to be at the pub with my friends.
That's right.
Is it just an intuitive choice? Do you think we have sort of appetites for each? How do they interact?
Yes. Well, in an article that came out just about a year and a month ago, Dan Goleman and I developed this test about 7 or 8 years ago to measure ordinary experiences of stress and renewal. So it gets you to look at last week. And what we finally proved, which the great stress researchers like Robert Sapolsky and some of the others always document more or less stress, but they really haven't focused on parasympathetic activation. Or as you said, the closest we've come to it is polyvagal theory and Naomi Eisenberger's work on the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. But when you get at that, you start to appreciate the fact that, in a given week, you want to have more moments, if you sum them all up, more time spent in renewal than stress. And so that's a raw intensity measure. I used to say when I was doing therapy with alcoholics, if you stay sober and then are working out 6 hours a day, you've just traded addictions. You've marginalized the power. You've marginalized the power of exercise by making it a task, of habituating it. And now we finally got the data, and we showed that not only does the intensity of renewal versus stress really key towards engagement, sense of well-being, empathy, reducing anxiety, all the measures you could figure out, but the variety of things you did in a typical week are also actually even slightly stronger predictive.
So you can't just do yoga every day. You need
That's right.
A few.
So, and when you get into it, you realize that there's another important message there, that more briefer doses or moments are key. It's more important for you to have more 15-minute moments of renewal than to spend an hour and a half at lunchtime doing something.
Makes
and
sense.
The variety is what comes back to your observation about don't do yoga, walk in the park, or go to a pub, because that's where the more you're in tune with yourself, you can sense that that's what you need for variety. Dan and I always have this kind of, I wouldn't say argument, but he believes that Dan Goleman, that the real movement towards these things always starts by looking inside. I have discovered in the past 20 or so years that it's not always the case, that for a whole lot of people, the opening into renewal starts by interacting with or caring for somebody else. In other words, the self-focus sometimes gets a little confused with how narcissistic we are these days. But when you step outside yourself to focus on another person, to care for them, it actually comes out of Confucian ideology of benevolence, of opening yourself up to the other. So what he and I now agree is that there are renewal things you can do that are things you do by yourself or with you in nature. And then there are things you do with other people. So having a moment with your friends or your spouse, partner, significant other, or your children, where you're just doing something that's fun, ends up being a major renewal moment.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like you see that meditation retreats after a few days or a week. People are like, can we have a party? Just want to party and sort of hit another angle. I wonder if there's one thing maybe missing from the equation here, which would be the sort of deliberately chosen hard things. So for me, it's like you want most of your life to be pleasant, to cope with a little bit of unpleasant, because that happens. We can't avoid it as long as it's not too big a portion of the relationship or the job or the place, and then a few things that are very deliberate, like weightlifting or cold showers, which are sort of deliberately done difficulty and challenge. Like that feels to me the third piece in this equation.
Yeah, it depends on the person, as to what your medicine is. What you're saying, which is a part of my theory, which is why certain people drum me out of the positive psychology movement, because I think the negative emotional attractor, the need for the sympathetic nervous system, is a part of life. I mean, we actually can't adapt unless we get stressed. We can't wake up. We can't make a decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, what you're raising, Mark, is what happens when somebody, starts to feel renewed, and if they try to stay in that zone too long, will they just levitate? They may, but what's more serious, we know from spending too much time in the empathic network, is you're subject to an awful lot of distractions and you just won't get something done. That's the
Yeah.
downside of that. So what happens when you want to stress yourself, when you want to, if you have a healthy regimen, physical fitness regimen, sometimes you're doing cardio and sometimes you're doing resistance training. I think it's the same thing mentally. It's the same thing emotionally.
Yeah.
So, there are times in which it's very satisfying to me, given my nerdy background, to just sit and study numbers. And so I don't follow a lot of sports teams, FC Barca and Boston Celtics and a few others, but not really avidly. So sports statistics doesn't do it. And I just developed over the years a fascination with studying economic and financial cycles in the stock market. So that's how sometimes I'll get my thing, or I'll spend time with my doctoral students, more time on their data set than they might like me to. Um, but the other thing is, there are times in which I know it's time for me to do something that is emotionally different.
Mm-hmm.
So there are times in which I'm in the mood for a Bruce Willis movie. I need a Die Hard kind of movie where the good guys, good people, to not make it gender specific, the good people unequivocally beat the crap out of the bad people. I mean, sometimes I need that as a
Yeah.
way to readjust something.
Yeah, we need to see the good guys win, because in life it's sometimes pretty much a mixed bag, isn't it? So,
Or it
for
takes too long.
the sake of hope, we need to see that played out, and
Yeah,
not over a
yeah.
100-year time frame.
But
Maybe.
But your notion of the fact is that we have to have sometimes these competing forces and emotions is exactly right. Because everything we know about the neurological functioning or hormonal functioning or the body is based on balance. And it's not just because I'm a Libra. It really is based on systems going back and forth.
Let's talk about change. I can see the clock rapidly going. I could talk to you for hours. But your latest book's on change, and it's tricky to get someone sober. It's tricky to get a manager to change their ways. We're homeostatic. Human beings are not the
That's right.
easiest people to change, even with
Yep.
therapy or coaching.
Yep.
What works, Richard? That's
Okay. This is what we've been devoting 25 years or so to. And for our neuroimaging studies and the hormonal studies and all the behavioral change studies, what we've discovered is that on the whole, most of the time when people try to help someone, you're actually doing what we call coaching for compliance. You're trying to help them to fit in with your image of what they should be doing.
okay.
And how do they feel in that moment? They feel as if you're being a helping bully. Now they may say, "Oh, thank you for that feedback. That's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
good," but they're not going to follow up on it. What we started to uncover 20 some years ago was that if you, and Melvin Smith and I first called it coaching with compassion, again, using a more Confucian definition of compassion, is if you coach or help them with a focus on them, on their vision, on their dreams, on their desires, what happens is you go into this parasympathetic activation and they go into it, and you start to feed each other in a very positive way. So our argument, now technically it's really coaching to this positive emotional attractor.
What they want
But
rather than what they don't want.
that's right.
Yeah.
And not their ought self, but their ideal self. I remember some executives in the 90s saying to me, wait a minute, if I spend a lot of time asking people report to me what's their ideal future 15 years from now, suppose it isn't to work in my company. My answer was, then they aren't now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what our sense is, and that's what that the more recent book is about, is what does that entail at a very nitty-gritty level? Well, first of all, it entails listening to the other person. And as Guy Itchkoff from in Tel Aviv says, it's deep listening. It involves focusing on the other person. It involves suspending your need to fix them or help them. It suspends your desire to give somebody else feedback. What I contend is most of the time when you want to give feedback, you're really wanting to vomit on somebody.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're not trying to help them. So one of my rules of thumb is don't. So people say, oh my God, well, suppose you see somebody doing something wrong. I said, well, if you tell them what they should be doing, they're not going to follow it anyway. So what do? You try to help them be more open. And if you help them be more open, they will probably be able to cognitively come to some evaluative stance where they'll realize some aspect of their behavior is dysfunctional. But they have to come to it. And if they don't, it's not going to work anyway.
Yeah. So letting people come to it themselves, not kind of being the benign bully, helping them go, okay, what is it I really want from my life? So they've got that vision for a better self. And I certainly think in a lot of personal growth is, we have to work on our stuff. We have to work on our negatives.
And that's all odd self. I mean, that's why when people try to lose weight, they can't.
Yeah.
They just yo-yo. Now, you talked about maintaining sobriety. During the years, I was working a lot with people who were either alcoholics or alcohol abusers. It became very clear that people had to maintain sobriety. But if that's all they did, they'd be back drinking within 6 months.
Right. So it's the 12-step helping others.
Well, you need a bigger purpose. Yes. And I happen to be one of the people who feels AA really does work. But my view is the reason AA works is the association with the higher power and the sponsor.
So it's the co-regulation and ritual of the group probably as well.
Yes. Well, that's the caring.
Your list earlier. Yeah.
That's the caring. So I actually think it's the interpersonal part and the spiritual part of AA that is the most potent. Are each of the steps in the 12-step program that crucial? I don't know. Something inside of me says they probably aren't, but you may need them to get to the other place.
Yeah. So sobriety, let's do weight loss then, because I've done great recently building muscle, but not so great on the weight loss. And I'm kind of like, how have I had two goals, right? Get stronger, wanted to be the strongest I'd ever been at 42. That's happened. Successfully got stronger over the last 4 months, beat my bench press record on Monday. Second goal, lose a little bit of fat as well. That hasn't worked. I'm trying to figure out why I was successful in one and not the other. And a lot of people listen to this.
I'm the worst person to ask about weight. I mean, because right now my physician, my internist says I should lose another 38 pounds. I spent the first 30 years of my life underweight and taller than I am now. Then during a 10-year period, I stopped smoking 3 times. I was running 2 companies and got married, so I was eating regular meals, and I gained close to 75, 85 pounds. And now, have I lost it, the weight? Yeah, I've lost 50 pounds 3 times.
Same here. Well, so I'm curious about that. We're people that work with change, we coach others, and yet there's this thing that's just tricky. Yeah, is it just how we're wired? What's going on there?
For a dose of authenticity, I say this when I'm giving my classes or talks, is that it's really hard. You were right with your earlier statement. It's hard because the process of change involves uncertainty, being vulnerable, and self-control, all of which stimulate stress. They are things that have been proven to stimulate stress. So the dilemma is, how do you do it in some way that's playful? I remember an internist 30 years ago or 40 years ago saying to me, well, did you play sports in high school or college? I said, yeah, I varsitied. He said, okay, now we're on to something. What was the sport? I said, riflery.
Got it. Got
It
it.
was, but it didn't.
Yes.
It turned out that I was successful in it because I learned to meditate before I knew what meditation was.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But
Yeah.
so the dilemma is, how do you lose weight? Well, you have to at some point manage your caloric intake, but I've actually managed that for decades. The problem I have is um, when I get excited or I know I'm in a stressful, like I'm teaching all day on my feet, I'll self-medicate with sugar. It's a
Yeah.
quick way to
Yeah.
respond, and at the university, especially in our executive activities, we always have plenty of pastries and cookies, and so I'll eat the dark chocolate covered nuts, not the milk chocolate covered nuts. But the fact is that ice cream and red wine are a nemesis to me, and
Looks like we're both on the same page with this. I mean, I enjoy lifting weights. I don't enjoy eating less wonderful Cypriot food, which was last night's killer. So it might be something as simple as enjoyment.
Growing up in a very Greek household, in which for the early years we only spoke Greek, and then later kind of English eased in. But whatever you ate, you held your fork on one hand and a piece of bread in the other. That was it.
Rich, we need to wrap up relatively soon, just to end at 5 to the hour. Is there anything that we sort of haven't covered that you think, this is a key part of my work, or something I just really like to have out there in the world?
Let me answer the one thing on losing weight.
Sure.
While you're trying to bulk up, you're actually doing the opposite to what you need to do to lose weight, because you're adding more dense muscle tissue. What you need to lose weight physiologically is more cardio. Now, the question is, if it doesn't come to you naturally, then find a way to do it interpersonally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's the dance form that I enjoy? What's the thing that I'm going to find fun? Where I'm going to know
use
something?
It as a way to find extra date nights with your wife.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sounds good. All right. I'll have to think about that. So wrap up things, Richard. Obviously, people can find your books, Primal Leadership, Resonant Leadership, the Change book. That's the latest one. Anything else?
Final message. Narcissism is rampant in our society. All around the world, it's rampant. It's outrageous. I mean, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography?
Right.
It's just, and there's only one antidote I know of, or easy antidote to narcissism, is to care about others. So while we all seek more enlightenment and more self-insight, I would strongly suggest to people that you pursue it not just by individual or socially isolated activities, but you pursue it by caring for others. And those of us who are trainers, therapists, teachers, whatever, that's our job. And we can do it in such a way that we're helping people feel it.
Richard, I really have enjoyed this. So you practice what you teach, and I was a bit sort of like, hey, this guy's kind of a big deal in the management world, and honestly, there's a lot of pricks in the management world, and particularly when they're famous and they've got a few books out. And I thought, what's he going to be like? I thought, let's find out. And I feel way better coming out of this conversation than into it, which I think is one of your signs of like a good manager or leader, is how they sort of leave you feeling. And you seem just like the real deal to me in terms of wisdom and kindness, not just intellectually, which is a rare combination. So
you caught me on a good empathy day.
It's been walking the dog earlier maybe, but I've seen other interviews with you. I don't think it's the only time. Richard, a real pleasure, sir.
Thank you.
Where do people find you online? Last thing, where do they find you? Where do they go?
Well, if you just Google my name, you'll probably do it. I don't have a particular website, but at the university I do, of course.
Okay.
Case Western
Richard,
Reserve. And
Boyatzis.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.